She was 43 years old, and by the second week of March in the year 1888, she owned nothing in this world but a wagon, a mule, and $9 folded into the toe of her boot. The man who cast her out was her own husband's brother, a lease broker named Otis Ashworth, who stood on the porch of the farmhouse she had scrubbed and mended for 11 years and told her, without much apology in his voice, that the deed had always been in his late father's name, and that the law and not his heart required her to go. What little he pressed into her palm on her way out the gate was $9, which he called generosity. 3 days later, cold and friendless in the town of Miller's Bend, Nebraska Territory, she stood before a crumbling, frost-blackened building down by the dry creek bend, a forgotten ice house nobody had touched in 20 years, and for $6, nearly all she had left in this world, she bought it. The men at the feed store laughed behind their hands and called it the foolish purchase of a foolish, grieving woman. They did not know that beneath the frozen drain in its floor lay a secret the whole town had spent 40 years trying to forget. A name that would not only change her life, but give Miller's Bend back something it never knew it had lost. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delphine Ashworth. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, the way an old ice house feels forgotten in springtime, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Delphine had not been born to hardship, not at first. She had been born Delphine Marchetti in 1845, the third daughter of an Italian stonemason and his Ohio-born wife, in a river town where her father cut headstones and door sills, and the cornerstones of churches that still stand today with his chisel marks pressed into them like a signature only he could read. Her father Enzo believed that stone remembered. He used to tell his daughters while they swept marble dust from the workshop floor that a stone carver's true work was not the carving at all, but the listening, that you had to press your palm flat against a block of granite or limestone and feel for where it wanted to break, where its grain ran true, before you ever lifted a chisel against it. Force it in the wrong place, he said, and you would only ever get rubble. Listen first, and even the hardest stone would open for you like a door. Delphine did not become a stonemason. There was no place for a woman at the yard in those years, but she carried her father's patience into everything else she touched. She learned to read the grain of bread dough and cloth and soil the way her father read granite. Learned that most things which looked worthless from a distance were only waiting for someone patient enough to see what they actually were. Her mother, Ruth, taught her letters and sums at the kitchen table by lamplight, insisting that a daughter who could read a ledger and a deed would never again be as helpless as a woman who could not. It was a lesson Delphine would not fully understand the value of until she was past 40 years old. Standing in a stranger's town with $9 to her name, she married Thomas Ashworth in 1862, a quiet, sandy-haired young farmer from Nebraska Territory, who had come through her river town buying stone for a well he was digging on newly claimed land, and who fell for her, by his own later confession, the moment he watched her correct the accounting of the very stone he was purchasing. Thomas was not a rich man, nor an ambitious one, but he was steady and he loved the black soil of his homestead with the quiet devotion some men reserve for scripture. Together they built a life on that land outside Miller's Bend, a soddy first, then a proper frame house, a good well, a garden Delphine kept with the same patience her father had taught her, listening to the soil the way he listened to stone, learning which corner held moisture longest, which rose wanted shade by midsummer. They had no children who lived past infancy, a grief they carried together without ever quite naming it aloud, the way farm people learn to carry all their grief, folded small and put away where it will not spill onto the daily chores. Thomas's younger brother Otis had gone a different direction entirely, moving into town proper, dealing in land leases and water rights and the buying and selling of other men's hardship, a business that Thomas, to his quiet credit, never had much respect for. When their father died in 1874, the homestead deed had been drawn up. By an old territorial custom, neither brother thought much about at the time, in the elder Ashworth's name alone, with the understanding as spoken, never written, that it would pass to Thomas and his family. Understandings, Delphine would come to learn, are worth exactly as much as the paper they are not written on. Thomas died in the January of 1888, of a lung fever that came on hard after a bitter cold snap, and Delphine buried him in the frozen ground of the little churchyard with her own hands helping to break the earth. Because there was no money to pay the men who usually did such digging. She was still in her black mourning dress, still finding his boots by the door and forgetting for half a breath that he would not be needing them, when Otis Ashworth arrived with a lawyer from the county seat and a paper proving that, since the original deed had never been formally transferred, and there was no living child to inherit, the land reverted under territorial law to the nearest male Ashworth kin, which was, conveniently and entirely to his benefit himself, Delphine argued. She showed him letters, showed him 11 years of labor in every fence post and outbuilding on that property, reminded him that his own brother's body was not yet cold in the ground. Otis was not cruel in the theatrical way villains are cruel in stories. He was worse than that. He was calm. He was sorry, he said, truly sorry. But the law was the law, and a woman without a deed in her name was a woman without a claim, whatever her labor had been worth. He gave her 3 days to gather her things, and on the 4th, $9 and a ride to the edge of his property in the back of a hired wagon, and that as far as Otis Ashworth was concerned, settled a debt he did not believe he owed in the first place. She arrived in the town proper of Miller's Bend on a raw, gray afternoon with the mule she'd been permitted to keep, a trunk of clothes and her mother's sewing box, and precisely $9, of which she had already spent 40 cents on bread and a night's stall rent for the mule. She took a room above the dressmaker's shop that Sunday, paid for with the promise of mending work, and spent her first days in town doing what any sensible woman does when she has almost nothing. She walked the streets and looked at what other people had thrown away. It was on her 3rd day, wandering down toward the dry bend of Miller's Creek where the old ice trade used to operate before the railroad brought refrigerated cars through and killed the local business for good, that she came upon a squat, sod-roofed building half swallowed by prairie grass, its double doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges, a hand-lettered sign nailed to a post reading for sale by town, $6 or best offer. The paint so faded it was more suggestion than word. A clerk from the land office, a young man named Aaron Pruitt, who seemed embarrassed even to be handling the transaction, explained that the town had inherited the old ice house when the last owner died without heirs some years back, and had been trying to unload it ever since, mostly because the taxes on empty land cost the town more than the land itself was worth. $6 would clear it entirely, sign and seal, hers to do with as she pleased. Delphine stood in the doorway and breathed in the smell of old sawdust and cold earth, and something else beneath it. Something mineral and patient, the same smell her father's stone yard used to carry on winter mornings, and she thought of his voice telling her that most things which looked worthless were only waiting to be understood. She paid the $6. The clerk counted it twice as if he could not quite believe anyone would want the place, and told her, not unkindly, that she'd bought herself a very cold, very empty box for the price of a week's groceries. The men loitering outside the feed store across the lane had a good deal more to say about it than the clerk did. Word travels fast in a small town. Faster still when the subject is a grieving widow with almost no money, spending nearly all of it on a building nobody else wanted. She heard the word foolish more than once in the days that followed. Heard herself described as touched in the head. Heard it said that Otis Ashworth's sister-in-law had gone soft with grief, and thrown away her last dollars on a heap of rotten timber. Delphine let them talk. She had grown up around men who judged stone by its dull gray surface and never once asked what it looked like on the inside. And she had learned from her father that such men were rarely worth arguing with. Instead, on a cold, clear morning in the last week of March, she rolled up her sleeves, borrowed a shovel and a wheelbarrow from the dressmaker's husband, and went down to the creek bend to see with her own hands and her own patience exactly what $6 had actually bought her. The inside of the ice house was one long, low room, dim even at midday. its walls thick with old sawdust insulation packed between double timber, built the way the old ice cutters used to build such places, so that the ice hauled off the river in January would last clear through August. Most of the sawdust had rotted to black mulch over the years, and a good portion of the roof had given way in one corner, letting a slant of daylight fall across the dirt floor like a blade. Delphine worked through the morning clearing debris, filling the wheelbarrow trip after trip, and it was in the early afternoon, prying up a warped floorboard near the back wall, that her fingers struck something harder than wood, a brass plate green with age, screwed into a support beam that had somehow escaped the general rot. She worked it loose with the edge of her shovel and carried it out into the light, rubbing the verdigris away with her thumb until letters emerged beneath the grime. J. Wren and Sons, Ice and Well Works, established 1849. She stood there a long moment with the plate warming in her palm, turning the name over in her mind. She had lived near Miller's Bend for 11 years as Thomas Ashworth's wife, had heard the town's history recited at church suppers and 4th of July gatherings more times than she could count, always the same telling, that Miller's Bend had been founded in 1849 by Cornelius Ashworth, Otis and Thomas's own grandfather, a man whose bronze-plated portrait hung in the town hall and whose name marked the main street running through the center of town. She had never once in 11 years heard the name Wren spoken by a living soul. That night, by a borrowed lamp in her room above the dressmaker's shop, Delphine wrote the name in her mother's old sewing box ledger and sat with it the way her father used to sit with an unfamiliar block of stone, turning it over, waiting to feel where the grain ran true. A town does not simply forget the name of its founder unless someone worked very hard to help it forget. She thought of Otis Ashworth's calm, sorrowful voice telling her the law was the law. She thought of the well that fed half the town's water troughs even now, the deed to which she had heard whispered more than once. Otis held a controlling lease upon, a lease that brought him a tidy sum every single year from the town council for water rights nobody quite remembered how he had come to control. She did not yet know what she had found, but she knew with the same certainty her father used to have standing before an uncut block, that there was more inside that ice house than sawdust and rotten timber, and she resolved that she would not stop digging until she understood exactly what it was. It took her the better part of 2 weeks, working the ice house alone in the mornings before her mending work, and alone again in the fading light of evening to clear the building room by room. She found little of consequence in the front chamber beyond the brass plate, old ice tongs gone to rust, a shattered lantern, the bones of a building doing what old buildings do, which is slowly returning to the earth. It was the back chamber, the coldest part of the old works, that held her attention longest because built into its floor was a deep stone-lined drain, the kind the old ice cutters used to carry meltwater safely away from the packed ice so it wouldn't rot the sawdust insulation around it. The drain had frozen solid decades ago and, judging by the undisturbed dirt packed over its grate, had likely stayed frozen and sealed with ice and silt every winter since, thawing only partway each summer before the next cold snap locked it up again. A small stubborn pocket of permanent winter tucked into the belly of the building. Delphine worked at the grate for 3 evenings, running with a fire pot set beside it to soften the ice. Patient the way her father had taught her patience, and on the 3rd evening, well past dark, the grate finally gave way beneath her crowbar with a groan of old iron, and beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and blackened but not rotted through, sitting in a shallow stone recess that had clearly been built for exactly this purpose, she found a strong box no larger than a bread pan, its lock long since rusted uselessly open. Inside, protected from 40 years of Nebraska weather by stone, ice and oilcloth, Delphine found a leather ledger, a bundle of letters tied with waxed twine, and a folded document whose seal she recognized even by lamplight as a territorial land grant. She carried the box up to her room that night with her heart going hard against her ribs, and she did not sleep before she had read every page. The ledger belonged to Josiah Wren, and it told in a careful clerk's hand across nearly 40 years of entries a story the town of Miller's Bend had apparently spent just as long trying to erase. Josiah Wren had come to the creek bend in 1848 with almost nothing, much as Delphine herself had arrived with almost nothing, and had staked the very first claim on the water, digging the town's original well and the following winter, cutting the first ice ever harvested off Miller's Creek for sale downriver, a trade that within a few short years had become the beating economic heart of the young settlement. Cornelius Ashworth, the ledger showed, had arrived a full 2 years later in 1850, not as a founder but as a hired hand. A young man Josiah Wren had taken on to help run the ice trade and had, by the ledger's own generous accounting, treated as something near a junior partner and eventually a friend. The land grant, dated 1849 and signed by a territorial officer whose seal Delphine did not recognize but whose signature was unmistakably official, granted Josiah Wren not only the icehouse ground but the surrounding creek bend commons, with an explicit clause, written in language a little old-fashioned but perfectly clear, that the well and its waters were to remain in perpetual trust for the free use of the townspeople, administered by the Wren family and their heirs, forever, so long as the town of Miller's Bend should stand. The letters told the rest in a sadder hand. In the winter of 1856, a diphtheria epidemic swept the Creek Bend settlement, and among its dead were Josiah Wren's wife and his 2 eldest children. Josiah himself, grief-broken and increasingly unwell, according to one letter from a neighbor woman, left the following spring for St. Louis with his one surviving child, a young son, intending to place the boy temporarily with relatives while he recovered his health, meaning to return within the year and reclaim his place at the head of the town he had built. He never came back. Whether he died on the journey or simply could not bear to return to the site of so much loss, the ledger did not say, and Delphine could find no further record of him. What she did find in the very last pages of the ledger, written not in Josiah's hand but in a different one, was a brief businesslike note dated 1858, recording that Cornelius Ashworth had assumed full operation of the ice and well works in the absence of the proprietor, and beneath it, in the town's own later records, which Delphine would go on to compare page by page, against the county archive over the following weeks, every subsequent mention of Josiah Wren's name had simply, quietly, stopped appearing at all. The commemorative plaque in Town Hall calling Cornelius Ashworth the founder of Miller's Bend had been erected in 1871. The same year, Delphine discovered with a chill she did not soon forget that Otis Ashworth's father first began collecting an annual leasing fee from the town council for the water rights to the very well Josiah Wren had dug. Delphine sat with all of this for 2 full days before she told a living soul, turning the ledger's pages again and again by lamplight, feeling for the grain of the thing the way her father had taught her. And slowly a fuller shape came into focus. Josiah Wren had not vanished into nothing. If he had a son who survived to adulthood, that son might have had children of his own. And if the original land grant still held any legal force, and territorial land grants, unlike gentlemen's understandings, were very much written on paper, then somewhere out there might exist a living Wren with a lawful claim not just to an old ice house but to the water beneath half of Miller's Bend, water that Otis Ashworth had been quietly profiting from for nearly 2 decades on the strength of a founding story that was not entirely true. She thought often, in those days of sorting old paper by lamplight, of her father's stone yard again, of the way he used to set aside a block other masons had rejected as flawed or worthless, turning it in the light until he found the vein of quartz or the seam of color that made it, in the end, worth more than a dozen plainer stones put together. She had never expected to need that lesson again quite so literally, kneeling on a cold dirt floor with a strong box open in her lap, but here it was, the same patient work in a different form, and she found herself grateful, in a way she had not expected to feel again so soon after Thomas's death, for a task that asked something honest of her hands and her mind both. It was Aaron Pruitt, the young land office clerk who had sold her the ice house in the first place, and who turned out to be considerably sharper than his shy manner suggested, who helped Delphine trace the thread further. Working evenings at the county recorder's office, sympathetic to a widow's plight in a way that surprised her, he found a record of a Josiah Wren Jr., who had been raised by an aunt in St. Louis and had, decades later, married and settled in the town of Belhaven, some 40 miles east, working as a wheelwright until his death in 1881. And Josiah Wren Jr., the parish records showed, had left behind one surviving child, a daughter, Mercy Wren, now Mercy Wren Calloway, a widow herself, 61 years old, presently keeping a small laundry business in Belhaven to support herself in her old age, entirely unaware, so far as anyone could determine, that her grandfather's name had ever meant anything more than a family story half remembered from childhood. The road to Belhaven took the better part of a day by mail wagon, and Delphine spent much of it rehearsing, silently and then half aloud, how a stranger might begin such a conversation with another stranger. How does one knock on a door and tell the woman who answers it that her grandfather's name had been quietly stolen from a town she had likely never set foot in, and that the theft had gone unnoticed for so long that even the thief's own descendants no longer thought of it as theft at all? She had no good answer by the time the wagon reached Belhaven's dusty main street, and so, in the end, she simply knocked and let the truth speak for itself. She found Mercy Wren Calloway exactly where the record said she would be, hanging linens in a small yard behind a modest frame house, a spare, weathered woman with her grandfather's same steady hands, as it turned out, for reading old accounts once Delphine laid them out on her kitchen table and explained, as gently and as clearly as she could, exactly what she had found frozen beneath a drain in an abandoned ice house 40 miles away. Mercy wept, not for the land or the money it might represent, but for a grandfather's name restored to a shape she could finally hold, a man who had until that afternoon been nothing more to her than a sorrowful shrug in her father's rare mentions of the past. It was Mercy who first said aloud what Delphine had already been turning over in her own mind for days, that whatever this discovery was worth, it was not worth much to two tired widows if it only bought them comfort, while the town that had forgotten Josiah Wren went right on forgetting him. Word reached Otis Ashworth before Delphine ever intended it to, carried, as it happened, by Aaron Pruitt's own supervisor at the land office, a cautious man who felt Otis, as a leading citizen and the largest leaseholder of town water rights, ought to be informed that a widow had been digging through old deeds concerning his family's history. Otis came to the ice house himself on a windy April afternoon, finding Delphine and Mercy Calloway sorting papers at a table she had set up just inside the door, and his calm, sorrowful manner from the day he had cast her off her own homestead was entirely gone, replaced by something harder and more frightened, though he dressed it up as such men do in the language of concern. He told her the ledger was likely a forgery, or at best a misunderstanding, that his grandfather Cornelius had built the town with his own two hands, and it was shameful for a grieving woman to go stirring up old lies to line her own pockets. He reminded her, none too gently, that she had no standing in Miller's Bend at all, no deed to her name, no family connection to any of this business, nothing but an ice house she had bought for $6 on a foolish whim. When threats of shame did not move her, he tried the language of law instead, sending his lawyer to argue that even if the land grant were genuine, 40 years of unchallenged use by the Ashworth family constituted a claim of its own, and that any attempt to disturb the current water leases would tie the town's council up in costly litigation for years, money the town of Miller's Bend, still recovering from 2 hard drought summers, could not remotely afford to spend on an old woman's crusade. A handful of townspeople, worried about their own water and unwilling to see the man who signed their leases made an enemy of, began to echo him, muttering that Delphine ought to leave well enough alone and be grateful for the roof over her head. Delphine did not raise her voice against any of it. She had learned long ago, watching her father work stone that fought him at every stroke, that the loudest argument rarely won against patient, careful proof. Instead, she and Mercy spent 3 weeks preparing what they had, cross-referencing the ledger against the county's own surviving deed books, gathering sworn statements from the two oldest living residents of Miller's Bend, a retired minister and a blacksmith's widow, both of whom, once asked directly and shown the brass plate with the Wren name upon it, admitted they did in fact recall, from childhood stories their own parents had told them, a vague and long-buried memory of a man named Wren who dug the first well before the fever years. Delphine requested, and was granted, a public hearing before the Miller's Bend Town Council, held on the last Saturday of May in the town hall itself, directly beneath the very portrait of Cornelius Ashworth that had hung there uncontested for 17 years. It was a full house that Saturday, curiosity and gossip having done what no formal notice could, and Delphine stood before the council with the strongbox open on the table before her, the ledger, the letters, the land grant with its territorial seal, and beside her, dressed plainly but standing very straight, Mercy Wren Calloway, granddaughter of the man whose name the town had spent 40 years forgetting. Delphine did not ask for the water rights to be stripped from every farmer who depended on them, nor did she ask for a single dollar to be paid to herself. She read the land grant's own words aloud, the clause promising the well and its waters in perpetual trust for the free use of the townspeople, and she asked the council a single plain question, whether a document written in good faith by the very man who had dug that well with his own hands, a man the town had simply stopped remembering, ought to matter less than 40 years of a leasing arrangement built on that forgetting. Otis Ashworth argued loudly against her, called the whole proceeding a spectacle, insisted the town owed him for decades of careful stewardship of the waterworks his family had maintained. But when the council's own recorder, at Delphine's quiet request, read into record the original 1849 grant alongside the 1871 date of the commemorative plaque and the far more convenient 1871 date on which the elder Ashworth's leasing fee first appeared in the town's account books, a murmur moved through the hall that Otis could not talk his way back out of. It was one of the town's own oldest farmers, a man named Hollis Greer, who had never had much use for Otis's leasing fees to begin with, who stood and said plainly that a man ought not to be permitted to profit from a name he had let the whole town forget. Even then, Otis was not without his defenders. A leaseholder named Vernon Deet stood to argue that whatever the old paperwork said, the waterworks as they stood had been built up, expanded, and maintained with Ashworth money and Ashworth labor across 3 decades, and that undoing the arrangement now would only punish a family for sins it had not personally committed. It was a fair point, and Delphine did not pretend otherwise when her turn came to answer it. She said only that she was not asking the council to erase what the Ashworth family had built, only to set it down beside what the Wren family had built first, so that both truths might stand together in the town's memory, the way they had once stood together, briefly and honestly, on a creek bend in 1850 before grief and convenience pulled them apart. It was that answer, more than any ledger page, that seemed finally to turn the room. The council voted after 2 hours of debate to formally recognize Josiah Wren as the town's true founder and Mercy Wren Calloway as his lawful heir, and to place the well and its surrounding water rights back into the perpetual public trust the original grant had always intended, ending Otis Ashworth's leasing arrangement effective that season and requiring, moreover, that the fees he had collected over the previous 5 years, the only span the statute of limitations still allowed to be examined, be repaid into a town relief fund. Otis left the hearing that evening a smaller man than he had entered it, his name no longer spoken with quite the same easy respect around Miller's Bend, no formal punishment beyond the loss of an income he had never rightly earned and the quiet, permanent knowledge among his neighbors of exactly how he had earned it. He did not go to prison, he did not lose his home, but he lost the one thing men like Otis Ashworth prize most dearly, which was the town's good opinion of him, and he lost it not by Delphine's cruelty, but simply by his own history being read aloud in daylight. Delphine and Mercy Calloway did not keep the relief fund for themselves. Together with the council's blessing, they used it to repair the town well proper, to dig a second well on the east side of town that had gone dry 2 summers running, and to establish a small standing fund for widows and orphans of Miller's Bend, seeded with the very money Otis Ashworth had been made to return, administered jointly by unanimous council vote, in the names of Wren and Ashworth both, the two families whose fortunes had been tangled together since 1850, finally set right in the town's own record books. A new plaque was cast for the town hall wall that summer, hung beside, not in place of, the old one, reading simply Josiah Wren, founder of the Well and Ice Works of Miller's Bend, 1849, remembered at last through the patience of Delphine Ashworth and the persistence of Mercy Wren Calloway. The old ice house itself Delphine kept, repaired its roof, cleared its drain for good, and turned it, with Mercy's help, into a modest boarding house for women arriving in Miller's Bend with little more than she herself had once carried, a wagon, a trunk, and whatever coin was left in the toe of a boot. And so we come back to where we began, to a 43-year-old widow standing before a crumbling ice house with $9 and a foolish notion, 6 of which she spent on a building the whole town had already given up on. It was never truly the ice house Delphine Ashworth was buying that cold March afternoon, though she did not know it herself at the time. It was the patience her father had taught her at a stone yard decades before. The belief that a thing which looks worthless from a distance is very often only waiting for someone careful enough and stubborn enough to press a palm flat against it and feel for where the truth was hiding. Beneath the frozen drain of that $6 building lay not treasure in the ordinary sense, not gold or jewels, but something the town of Miller's Bend had lost without ever quite noticing the losing of it. A name, a founder, a family, a debt of memory finally repaid. Delphine had arrived in that town with nothing, cast out by a man who believed the law was the only ledger that mattered, and she left it not wealthy exactly, but restored. And in restoring a forgotten name to its rightful place, she restored something in herself as well, the simple, hard-won knowledge that a woman with nothing but patience and $9 could still, in the end, set an entire town right. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Delphine Ashworth's story. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need a reminder that what looks forgotten is not always worthless. And we would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? A person, a place, an object, or perhaps even yourself. Until next time, stay close.